Hello, welcome to Deadliest Disasters, where we cover some of the most devastating events that happened throughout history. On the morning of April 16th, Texas experienced what would become the deadliest industrial accident in American history. What began as a small fire aboard a docked ship escalated into a cataclysmic chain of explosions that claimed at least 581 lives, injured thousands more, and effectively destroyed much of the city. What is known as the Texas City disaster remains a sobering reminder of the potential dangers of industrial chemicals, the importance of proper safety protocols, and the devastating consequences when those protocols fail. Today we'll explore what happened on that fateful day, why it happened, and what lessons this tragedy has taught us about industrial safety. To understand the disaster, we must first understand Texas City as it existed in 1947. The city is located on Galveston Bay, about 40 miles southeast of Houston. Texas City was a bustling industrial port town with a population of about 16,000. The city had grown rapidly during World War II as its deepwater port and strategic location made it an ideal hub for the petrochemical industry. By 1947, Texas City was home to major facilities belonging to companies like Monsanto, Union Carbide, and Republic Oil, among others. The port handled thousands of tons of cargo daily, connecting the petroleum and chemical production of Texas with markets around the world. On April 16th, several ships were docked at the port. Among them was the SS Grand Camp, a former Liberty ship built during World War II and now under French operation. The Grand Camp had arrived on April 11th and was being loaded with cargo, including 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer destined for post-war agriculture recovery efforts in Europe. Ammonium nitrate, while primarily used as a fertilizer, is also a powerful oxidizer that can become explosive under certain conditions. During World War II, it had been a key component in munitions. Now in peacetime, the same chemical was being shipped in large quantities for agricultural use. The chain of events began around 8 a.m. on April 16th when dock workers noticed smoke coming from the cargo hold of the Grand Camp. The ship's captain ordered the hatches battened down and had the hold filled with steam, a standard firefighting technique that worked well for most fires by depriving them of oxygen. However, this was a critical mistake. Ammonium nitrate produces its own oxygen when it decomposes, so sealing the hold and introducing steam only increased the temperature and pressure inside, accelerating the chemical reaction rather than suppressing it. The fire continued to grow. At 8:30 a.m., the captain reluctantly decided to call the Texas City Fire Department. By this time, the smoke, described as peculiarly colored with an unusual smell, had attracted the attention of dock workers, refinery employees, and curious townspeople who gathered along the shore to watch the firefighting efforts. 27 of the 28 members of the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department responded to the call, positioning their equipment on the dock beside the ship. Meanwhile, the Grand Camp's crew was ordered to abandon ship. At 9:12 a.m., the gathering crowd experienced a moment that would forever divide their lives into before and after. The ammonium nitrate reached a critical temperature and exploded with a force so powerful that it registered on seismographs as far away as Denver, Colorado, which is over 1,000 miles away from where the disaster took place. The explosion was catastrophic. The Grand Camp disintegrated instantly. The massive shockwave flattened nearly 1,000 buildings in the surrounding area. The ship's 1.5-ton anchor was flung 2 miles inland. A 15-foot tidal wave caused by the blast swept the dock area, washing away small buildings and vehicles. Perhaps most devastatingly, the explosion ignited ammonium nitrate dust in the air, creating a fireball that engulfed the dock area and spread to nearby oil storage facilities and refineries. All 27 members of the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department who had responded to the fire perished instantly, as did many of the onlookers who had gathered to watch. At the nearby Monsanto chemical plant, 145 of their 450 workers on shift that morning lost their lives. But this was only the beginning of the disaster. The sheer force of the blast had caused fires to break out across the industrial district. More critically, it had also damaged another vessel docked in the harbor, the SS High Flyer, which was carrying an additional 961 tons of ammonium nitrate and 1,800 tons of sulfur. For hours, the high flyer burned while tugboats attempted to tow the damaged vessel away from the dock. These efforts failed as the ship's anchor chain had become entangled with wreckage. At 1:10 a.m. on April 17th, after burning for 16 hours, the high flyer exploded, killing workers who had survived the first blast and were risking their lives in rescue operations to save the public. This second explosion, while less devastating than the first due to the evacuation that had already taken place, caused further damage to the already devastated port. The disaster had unfolded over nearly 24 hours, with 2 major explosions and countless smaller fires and blasts throughout the industrial area. The immediate response to the disaster was hampered by the fact that most of Texas City's emergency personnel had been killed in the initial explosion. The city's firefighting capability was effectively destroyed, leaving the fires to spread freely in the immediate aftermath. Help began arriving from surrounding communities within hours. Firefighters from Galveston, Houston, and other nearby towns rushed to the scene. The U.S. military deployed personnel from nearby bases, including medical staff, engineers, and security forces. The Coast Guard mobilized ships and personnel to participate in rescue operations both in the water and on land. Local hospitals were quickly overwhelmed with injured victims. Many of the wounded had to be transported to medical facilities in Galveston, Houston, and even as far away as San Antonio. Schools, churches, and community buildings were converted into temporary treatment centers and morgues. The scale of the disaster presented major challenges for first responders. Fires continued to burn for days. Toxic chemicals had been released into the air and the water. Buildings were structurally compromised, creating dangers for rescue workers. The sheer number of casualties, both dead and injured, overwhelmed available resources. Despite these challenges, the response effort grew rapidly. Red Cross workers poured into the city, establishing aid stations and registration centers for displaced residents. The Texas National Guard arrived to assist with security and recovery operations. Over the coming days, more than 5,000 outside personnel would participate in the response. The human toll of the Texas City disaster was staggering. The official death count eventually reached 581, though many historians believe the true number was higher, as some victims were never identified or were completely vaporized in the explosion. The demographics of the victims reflected the community and those who had gathered at the dock that morning. The entire volunteer fire department was lost. Dock workers, seamen, and industrial employees made up a large portion of the casualties. Plant workers at the nearby Monsanto facility suffered terrible losses, and many curious onlookers, including children who had gathered to watch the colorful smoke from the ship fire, perished when the explosion occurred. Thousands more were injured, many severely. Hospitals reported extensive burn injuries, lacerations from flying glass and debris, broken bones, and lung damage from toxic smoke. In total, more than 5,000 people were injured, nearly a third of Texas City's total population. The task of identifying the dead proved enormously difficult. Many bodies were mangled beyond recognition. Others were recovered in fragments. The local funeral homes and morgues were completely overwhelmed, forcing authorities to establish a temporary morgue in the high school gymnasium. For days, families waited in line to attempt to identify loved ones from personal effects, clothing remnants, or distinguishing marks. Among the most poignant stories from the disaster is that of Fred Dowdy, who lost his wife and all 3 of his children. They had gone to the docks to bring him lunch just before the explosion. Such personal tragedies were repeated hundreds of times throughout the community. Recovery operations continued for weeks. Some bodies were found days or even weeks after the explosion as debris were cleared. Some victims were never recovered at all, having been completely destroyed in the intense heat of the blast and the resulting fires. The physical damage caused by the Texas City disaster was unprecedented for an industrial accident in the United States for that time. The Grand Camp explosion created a 15-foot deep, 200-foot wide crater at the dock where the ship had been moored. The resulting shockwave, traveling at an estimated 7,600 miles per hour, flattened everything in its immediate vicinity. Nearly all structures within a half-mile radius were completely destroyed. The Monsanto chemical plant, one of the largest in the country, was leveled. Oil storage tanks ruptured and caught fire, adding to the destruction. The grain elevator, an imposing concrete structure, was severely damaged. In total, 1,000 buildings were destroyed and another 1,500 buildings suffered significant damage. The city's infrastructure was completely devastated. Water mains ruptured, hampering firefighting efforts. Power lines came down, plunging areas of the city into darkness. Roads were blocked by debris, making access difficult for emergency vehicles. The property damage was later estimated at over 100 million, which would be equivalent to well over 1 billion in today's currency. The port facilities, which are the economic lifeblood of Texas City, were largely destroyed. 2 more ships in addition to the Grand Camp and the High Flyer were severely damaged. Docks, warehouses, railways, and loading equipment were wrecked, effectively shutting down port operations. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Many businesses were physically destroyed, others lost their entire workforce. With the port inoperable, the flow of goods and materials that sustained the local economy came to a halt. For a time, it seemed possible that Texas City might never recover from the devastation. In the wake of the disaster, multiple investigations were launched to determine its cause and whether it could have been prevented. The most comprehensive was conducted by the U.S. Coast Guard and the Bureau of Mines. Their findings highlighted several critical factors that contributed to the catastrophe. First and foremost was the nature of the cargo itself. Ammonium nitrate, while classified as a fertilizer, had well-documented explosive properties. During World War II, it had been used extensively in munitions, and its potential dangers were known to scientists and military personnel. However, when the war ended and ammonium nitrate shifted to primarily agricultural use, the safety protocols surrounding its transports were relaxed. The specific form of the ammonium nitrate was also significant. It had been packaged in paper bags and coated with wax to prevent moisture absorption during shipping. This wax coating made the material more combustible. Furthermore, the ammonium nitrate had been manufactured using a process that resulted in smaller, more reactive granules compared to modern production methods. The investigation also highlighted several warning signs that had been ignored. The unusual color of the smoke, described as orange-red, indicated a chemical fire rather than an ordinary combustible fire. The strange smell reported by witnesses was another clue that this was not a standard cargo fire. Most critically, the decision to fight the fire with steam and attempt to seal the hold accelerated the disaster rather than preventing it. This highlighted a dangerous knowledge gap. The ship's crew and local firefighters were not adequately informed about the properties of ammonium nitrate or the appropriate methods for handling a fire involving this chemical. The final conclusion was stark. The disaster, while triggered by an accidental fire of unknown origin, had been made vastly worse by a combination of inadequate safety regulations, improper handling procedures, and insufficient awareness of chemical hazards. The Texas City disaster sparked an unprecedented legal battle that would eventually reach the Supreme Court and establish important precedents in American liability law. In 1948, a lawsuit was filed against the United States government on behalf of the 8,485 victims, survivors, and family members. What is known as Elizabeth Dalehite v. United States became the first major test of the recently enacted Federal Tort Claims Act, which allowed citizens to sue the federal government for negligence. The plaintiff's argument centered on the government's role in the production, packaging, and shipping of the ammonium nitrate. The fertilizer had been produced in government facilities according to government specifications as part of the American aid program to help rebuild agriculture in post-war Europe. The lawsuit alleged that the government had been negligent in its handling of a known dangerous substance. Initially, a federal district judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs in 1950, awarding $75 million in damages. However, this decision was later reversed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The case ultimately reached the Supreme Court, which ruled in 1953 in a narrow 4-3 decision that the government was protected by sovereign immunity under the discretionary function exception to the Federal Tort Claims Act. This ruling was a devastating blow to the victims and their families. While Congress would later provide some limited compensation, the amount was far less than what had been sought and needed. The legal battle, while ultimately unsuccessful for the plaintiffs, established important precedents regarding government liability and highlighted the need for clear regulations regarding hazardous materials. It also led to changes in maritime insurance and eventually contributed to stronger government oversight of chemical shipping and handling. Despite the scale of destruction, Texas City showed remarkable resilience in its recovery efforts. Rebuilding began almost immediately, even as recovery operations were still underway. Monsanto announced within days its intention to rebuild its destroyed plant, providing hope for economic recovery. The company kept all of its employees on the payroll during reconstruction. The port facilities, vital to the city's economy, were prioritized in the rebuilding effort. While it would take months to restore the full functionality, temporary facilities were quickly established to resume at least limited operation. Housing was another urgent need. With thousands of homes damaged or destroyed, temporary housing was established while reconstruction took place. The Red Cross, Salvation Army, and other relief organizations provided essential support during this period. Community solidarity played a crucial role in the recovery. Churches and civic organizations coordinated relief efforts. Neighboring communities provided support and resources. This spirit of mutual aid helped sustain the people of Texas City through the difficult rebuilding period. By 1948, significant progress had been made. While scars from the disaster remained, both physical and emotional, Texas City was functioning again. The rebuilt industrial facilities incorporated new safety features. The port reopened with improved handling procedures. And on May 3, 1947, less than 3 weeks after the disaster, a special session of the Texas City Fire Department induction ceremony saw 100 men volunteer to rebuild the fire department that had been completely destroyed. Tragically, the lessons of Texas City have had to be relearned repeatedly throughout history. Ammonium nitrate has been involved in numerous other disasters. In 2013, the West Fertilizer Company explosion in West Texas killed 15 people and injured over 160. Approximately 30 tons of ammonium nitrate detonated. Investigations revealed inadequate storage practices and poor regulatory oversight. Most recently, in 2020, the port of Beirut, Lebanon, experienced a catastrophic explosion when approximately 2,750 tons of improperly stored ammonium nitrate detonated. The blast killed at least 218 people, injured thousands, and caused billions of dollars in damage. The similarities to Texas City were striking: a port setting, improper storage, and an initial fire that triggered the main explosion. These and other similar incidents form a pattern that safety experts refer to as lessons learned, lessons forgotten. Each disaster brings renewed attention to the dangers of ammonium nitrate and other industrial chemicals, followed by promises of reform. Yet over time, complacency often returns. Safety measures are relaxed, and the conditions for another disaster slowly develop. This cycle highlights the ongoing challenge of maintaining industrial safety vigilance across generations and the critical importance of preserving institutional knowledge about chemical hazards. Today, the Texas City disaster is commemorated by a memorial in the city that honors those who lost their lives. The twisted anchor from the Grand Camp, recovered 2 miles from the explosion site, stands as a monument to the power of the blast and the lives it claimed. For the modern petrochemical industry, Texas City represents both a founding tragedy and an ongoing obligation. To remain vigilant, to prioritize safety over expediency, and to never forget the potential consequences when that obligation is neglected. The 1947 Texas City disaster stands as one of America's most devastating industrial accidents, a tragedy born from a complex interplay of chemical properties, human decisions, regulatory failures, and simply bad luck. The 581 lives lost that day, the firefighters who rushed toward danger, workers who were simply doing their jobs, and the curious onlookers who had no idea of the risk, remind us of the human cost of industrial failures. The thousands injured and the community devastated speak to the far-reaching consequences of such events. Yet from this tragedy emerged important advances in chemical safety, emergency response, and disaster management that have likely saved countless lives in the decades since. Every hazard warning label, every emergency response plan, every specialized chemical firefighting technique owes something to the lessons purchased at such terrible cost in Texas City. As we continue to depend on industrial chemicals for modern life, the Texas City disaster stands as both a memorial to those lost and a persistent reminder of our responsibility to handle dangerous materials with appropriate respect, to maintain safety systems with uncompromising diligence, and to remember that behind every safety regulation lies a possibility of preventing another tragedy. Thanks for watching today's video on this devastating but important historical event. If you found this informative, please hit that like button and subscribe for more historical deep dives. And let me know in the comments what other overlooked historical events you'd like to learn about. Until next time, this has been Deadliest Disasters.